why are you still building sounds from scratch? Every tutorial teaches sound design from scratch, but today we're going to do things differently. That's the same preset. And this goes to show that you don't need to build sounds from scratch, but it's really what you do with a preset that counts. So we're in this synth plugin called Sylenth1. And you can really use any synth plugin, Serum, Massive, doesn't matter, the principles hold. But this is where something just like this by the Chainsmokers and Coldplay started. And here's how exactly. They went to Soundbank 3, preset called Key Icicle, which sounds like this. And they turned this preset into a sound that got billions of streams. And here's how they did it. First of all, they opened the cutoff, which really is a tone control. If we lower the cutoff, the sound gets darker and more closed off, like this. But if we open it, the sound gets super bright and sharp, like this. Now the Chainsmokers needed this sound really to cut through and sound bright, so they opened the cutoff filter all the way. Now the next thing they did happened inside this little window over here, which are built-in effects. And most synth plugins have something like this. In this case, by default, these three effect plugins are enabled already. What we want to do is we want to lower the reverb. So reverb is the echo sound you hear on a lot of different sounds. Too much of it and the sound is distant and very atmospheric. We want to lower it in this case so it feels like it's played in a smaller room, so it's more intimate. And we're going to adjust the size knob to achieve that. Much better. Next, we're going to look at the delay effect, which is somewhat similar, but instead of it being this continuous echo, this repeats the sound after it's played based on timing. And in a busy mix, this easily blurs everything together through its repetition. So in this case, we're just going to completely disable it, and you'll see the sound gets much tighter and shorter. Simply because it just hits once very cleanly. Okay, so the next move the Chainsmokers made was in this little window over here, which is the envelope, and this essentially controls how a sound behaves over time. And every synth plugin has something like this: 4 knobs or faders, the ADSR, attack, decay, sustain, and release. And it's very good to know what these do. They control the shape of the sound. The best way to understand this is simply by tweaking them and trying to listen how your sound changes. In this case, we're going to tweak 2 knobs, the sustain and the release. The sustain is how long the sound holds as we hold a note. And in this case, we want that to be all the way up so the sound doesn't gradually become quieter as we hold a note. Let's make sure we also apply that to part B in this synth. So if we hold a note now, it remains nice and consistent. Next, we want to tweak the release knob, which is how long a sound continues playing as you release a note or a key. So in this case, when we release a note, it still plays for a little bit longer, right? But we want it to be super tight. So in this case, I'm going to lower the release to something like this. Again, also for part B. So it stops much more abruptly once we release the notes. And that's what leads to this. Much tighter and much more plucky. By the way, if you struggle to finish songs, we've put together a free 90-minute lesson that fixes that. Link below. So then let's make a very subtle tweak that extends on the built-in effects we talked about before, but instead of doing this internally, let's do it externally on the mixer channel. So first we're going to add some EQ to boost the high frequencies and also to remove some of the muddiness in the mids of the sound. So here's before and here's after. Just a little more crispy and bright. And second, we're going to add a sidechain plugin called Kickstart 2 by Nicky Romero, but you can use any sidechain plugin here, which creates that docking energetic effect, typically when the kick hits, but in this case it adds a really nice bit of movement and rhythm. So here's without, and here's with. So really 3 simple moves and you have a completely different sound. But the Chainsmokers are not the only ones who work this way. Martin Garrix did the exact same thing in the same plugin but with a different preset. So if you have Silent One, you have this exact sound and it's the main lead from his song Poison. So let's go to the second sound bank to this preset called 137 ARP 5th Prophet, which sounds like this by default. Yeah, not great, kind of cringe actually. So the first thing he did was disable the arpeggio, and an arpeggio takes the notes of a chord and plays them one at a time in a repeating pattern instead of, all at once. So that's what made this raw factory preset sound super busy, mechanical, and cringe. So once we disable it, the sound just plays as one instead of this sequence, which is exactly what Martin Garrix needed. Next, we're going to dive into these things called oscillators. And an oscillator is the raw skeleton of a sound inside a synth, the actual source of the sound, if you will. In this case, Silent, there's 4 different oscillators, A1, A2, B1, and B2. And each oscillator runs off this thing called a wavetable, and there's different ones of them. We have sine, saw, triangle, pulse, half pulse, quarter pulse, tri-saw, and noise. These are the most common ones you see in most plugins. But the important thing to remember is that different wavetables give you completely different tones, from bright to dark, from harsh to smooth. So in this case, we have this saw wavetable, which sounds like this. Let's see what happens if we change it to a triangle. Quite different, right? It sounds much less bright. So essentially, this way we can really shape the skeleton of the sound. But what I want to do specifically, what Garrix did specifically, is lower the pitch of one of the oscillators. Because right now, oscillator A2 by default plays 5 semitones higher than the other ones, which creates this chord kind of sound. So we're going to lower that to 0, so it plays the same pitch and it sounds lower and more natural, which sounds like this. So yeah, this one adjustment really just dropped this sound into exactly the frequency range where it needed to be. And finally, we're going to once again dive into the built-in delay effect, but instead of disable it like we did before, we're simply going to lower the intensity, so the delay effect is a little more subtle, like this. So what we get now is the Martin Garrix Poison synth. And once again, 3 super simple moves turned a cringe preset into a very memorable sound. Okay, so if Martin Garrix and the Chainsmokers both use factory presets to make hits, now there is this belief that the biggest producers create everything from scratch. And if you like building from scratch, definitely do so. But the evidence from, multi-billion song sessions like the Chainsmokers, something just like this, but also Roses, which uses the same key icicle preset, suggests otherwise. So the skill isn't necessarily sound design, but it's more taste and knowing how to effectively tweak existing presets. And that works in any plugin. We use Silent, but you can use Serum, Massive, whatever plugins come with your DAW. But as a general rule of thumb, there are like 4 things you could tweak to really change the feel and the shape and the timbre of a sound. So we have the wavetables, right? We talked about that. We have the shape through the 4 envelope settings. We have effects, whether internal or external. And finally, we have filter settings. And you can actually use filters to create movement as well, which I'll show you now. So we're back inside the ARP Fifth Prophet Martin Garrix sound. And remember, the filter cutoff knob is essentially our tone control. But instead of leaving it to one position the entire song, what Martin Garrix did was he drew a curve or an automation clip that makes sure it closes and opens over time. So the way to do this is simply touch or move the knob we want to automate, in this case the filter cutoff, go to add and hit automation for last tweaked parameter. And then we can essentially just draw a shape to control the filter cutoff over time. And in this case, that could look something like this, where at first it's closed, it opens, and then goes back to being closed again. And the best way to hear what this is doing is by A/Bing it. So here's before the automation. And here's after. So you hear how it's not still anymore. Like before we had the automation, it was just the exact same filter cutoff all the time, right? Then we enabled the automation and we suddenly got tension and release, right? The sound opened, then closed, which is much more exciting and really adds life to the song, which is a very effective trick that uses one aspect of sound design and combines it with movement with one of the capabilities any DAW offers, which is automation clips. So another way to make your presets more interesting is by using something called LFO, which stands for low frequency oscillation. This can be very cool because this allows you to move certain aspects of your sounds, for example, the filter cutoff, the pitch, essentially any parameter within your plugin. So in this case, let's say we want to make the pitch move. Let's select pitch A and B as the destination. Make sure we select A and B because our sound has both a part A and a part B. And the shape of the movement is determined by the wavetable we select here. So if we select sine, we get this more round movement, which I like. Then we want to see, how much we're going to actually move the pitch. I don't want to move it too much, so let's go for something like 0.25 maybe. And then the rate is very important because right now, as the gain is at 0, nothing really happens when we play a note. If we increase the gain, we get this increasingly robotic sound, which is because the rate is set too fast. So if we lower the rate, look what happens to the sound. It gets much more normal, and actually you can really hear that wobbly pitch effect. And that's because that sine wave shape is now being applied in a much slower rate or frequency. So one thing you could do, let's increase the cutoff to make it more audible, is you could set the gain to 0 at first so nothing really happens. But the longer you hold a note, you could, for example, automate this gain knob so that pitch wobbliness kind of is introduced more and more. You can get really creative with that, and not just with pitch, but you can make any aspect of your sounds move, which is a super effective tool when tweaking presets. Okay, we've talked about tweaking presets, but here's the thing nobody tells you. This is an Omnisphere factory preset called Whistler's Bells. Completely untouched, but it got over 2 billion streams on Spotify on Ariana Grande's 7 Rings. The producer heard it, played the melody, and just left it exactly as it was, which is crazy, right? But if you really think about it, Nobody cares when you made or didn't made a sound from scratch, right? Or how many knobs you tweaked or how well you know a VST, right? Listeners only care how a sound, how a song makes them feel. And that's the essence of sound design as well as sound selection, right? Like, it's better to be able to find the right sound for a song than to be able to make sounds that aren't right for the song, right? And sound selection as well as tweaking presets really proves that. I mean, if you look at the records by the Chainsmokers, Martin Garrix, the ones we talked about before, right? You see that they took super simple factory presets from Silent One, made a few tweaks, and created super memorable sounds in just 3 moves, usually. So, every tutorial teaches sound design from scratch, but now you know it doesn't have to be that way. If you made it this far in the video, our 7-day producer blueprint has an entire section dedicated to both sound selection as well as sound design. So if that sounds interesting to you, go check it out in the description below. Also, if you like this video, make sure to subscribe for more like this, and I'll see you next time.